A soldier boards a quiet city bus and notices a little black girl sitting beside a well-dressed man. Something feels wrong. Her silence, her posture, the fear in her eyes, it all points to something darker. When she finally whispers 3 words, his world flips upside down. Subscribe for more and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? The bus groaned to a stop at a faded curb in the outer edge of the city, where the buildings sagged under the weight of neglect and the sky seemed permanently stained by a haze of fatigue. It was the kind of place that never made the news unless something burned. At midday, the route was nearly empty. Just a handful of passengers scattered like forgotten coats. Michael Hart sat in the 3rd row from the front, window seat, shoulders squared, spine rigid despite the warm sway of the vehicle. His eyes weren't fixed on anything in particular, but they missed nothing. He hadn't meant to ride this far. It was supposed to be a short trip to the corner store, a walk around the block, a way to fill time he hadn't yet learned how to live with. But the routine of civilian life chafed against him like wool on a burn. He wasn't used to soft sounds and stillness. His world had been defined by threat matrices, convoy paths, weapon checks. Here, the only threat was boredom, or so he told himself. The brakes hissed and the doors folded open with a reluctant wheeze. 2 new passengers boarded at the intersection near a convenience store that had long since stopped being convenient. The first was a man in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, clean-shaven, dressed in an Oxford shirt with a subtle gray checkered pattern, the sleeves rolled up neatly to the elbows. There was a certain stiffness to him, too polished, too deliberate. His eyes swept the interior of the bus like he was assessing more than just seating options. Behind him, clutching the edge of his jacket, came a girl. Small, slender, no more than 8 years old, though the oversized military-style jacket swallowed her frame so completely she could have passed for younger. Her skin was a warm brown, her eyes wide and downcast. Her black hair was braided in a way that suggested it hadn't been redone in days. She moved like a shadow, each step hesitant, almost apologetic. Michael noticed the man's hand on the girl's wrist before he noticed anything else. Not her silence, not her ill-fitting jacket, not her limp. Just the grip. It was not a father's gentle tether. It was an anchor. They passed him without a word. The man glanced at Michael in that way some people do when they're aware they're being watched and resent it. He gave the faintest smile as if to say, "Mind your own." Michael offered nothing in return. The girl didn't look up. They sat in the last row. The man positioned himself on the outside, boxing her in against the window. His arm stretched across the back of the seat, casual in theory, but Michael had spent too many hours reading body language to be fooled by gestures. It was not casual. It was containment. He shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting his line of sight to the narrow bus mirror overhead. Years of training whispered in the back of his mind, low and steady. Don't ignore discomfort. Don't dismiss instinct. But another voice, louder, angrier, cut through. Don't be that guy. Don't see crime where there isn't any. Don't look at a white man and a black child and assume something's wrong. That was the trouble. Out there, in the sand, in the alleys, on the dirt roads, he'd been taught to act on instinct without pause. Hesitation got people killed. Here, in this place of rules and paperwork, hesitation was expected. Judgment had to pass through layers of protocol. There were social consequences for being wrong, but something didn't sit right. The girl hadn't spoken, not once. Her face was expressionless, her eyes glassy. She sat with her shoulders hunched, her hands hidden in the folds of her coat. The man whispered something to her, and she responded with a barely perceptible nod. No eye contact, no smile, no hint of familiarity. Michael's mind flicked through scenes he'd tried hard to forget. Children used as decoys, as shields, as tools. He saw a boy with a vest rigged to his ribcage stepping through a checkpoint. A girl handing off a plastic bag that detonated minutes later. Monsters wore many masks. They didn't all speak Arabic or wear uniforms. Some wore polite smiles and Oxford shirts. He forced himself to look away, focusing on the blur of city streets outside the window. He counted storefronts, lampposts, people crossing against the light. Anything to silence the rising churn in his gut. But then the girl shifted, just slightly. Her sleeve fell back an inch, revealing her wrist. Michael's breath caught, red, thin and raw, like rope burn or a tightly cinched zip tie. Not a scrape, not a playground accident, not something easily explained. His stomach turned. The man leaned in again, whispering something sharp and low. The girl didn't flinch this time. She simply froze. Michael exhaled slowly, trying to gauge the pounding in his chest. He couldn't act on this. Not yet. The man wasn't doing anything overtly illegal. The girl hadn't asked for help. And there was nothing that pointed to certainty. Only gut, only training, only the memory of too many bad decisions made too late. The driver called out the next stop. The brakes hissed again. More passengers got on. A middle-aged woman with shopping bags, a teenager with earbuds and dead eyes. The bus rumbled back to life. Michael watched the man's knee bounce. His hand tapped against the back of the seat in a rhythmic pattern. Impatient, perhaps, or anxious. He could feel the weight of his own doubt settling around him like armor. He had no badge, no authority, just a soldier's sense of trouble and a civilian's limitations. Every moment he waited increased the odds that he was wrong, or worse, that he was right and doing nothing. He glanced at the other passengers. They weren't watching. They weren't wondering. They were buried in their phones, their thoughts, their distractions. No one else had noticed the girl's wrist. No one else seemed to care. He looked again toward the back. The girl had sunk lower into her seat. Her small frame folded in on itself, trying to disappear. She glanced up for the briefest second. Their eyes met. Michael saw it, clear as a desert sun. Not fear, not confusion, but a question, a plea, help. Her lips didn't move, her shoulders didn't shift, but her eyes spoke louder than anything he'd heard in months. He sat forward, his pulse thundering. That was it. The line had been crossed. Whatever the world might say, whatever social codes he might be breaking, he would not ignore that look. But as he stood, someone behind him cleared their throat loudly. He turned to see a woman, maybe 60, watching him with narrowed eyes. "You got a problem, young man?" she asked, her voice crisp. Michael blinked. "Sorry?" "You been staring back there like you're waiting for a fight," she said. "Ain't your business. Some people raise their kids different, that's all." Michael opened his mouth, but nothing came. The bus hit a bump, jolting everyone. The girl didn't move. The man gave her a quick glance. He turned back around, his mouth dry. The weight of that woman's accusation clung to him like smoke. Not your business, not your place, not your child. But the look in that girl's eyes said otherwise. The driver announced an unscheduled stop ahead. Something about a systems check, a chance for passengers to stretch their legs. Michael knew better. Drivers didn't pull over in this part of town unless something made them nervous. As the bus coasted toward the shoulder, Michael stood again, steadier this time. He didn't care about the stairs now. He didn't care about being labeled, because something was wrong in the last row of the bus. And this time, he was going to find out what. The bus rolled to a slow halt alongside a crumbling sidewalk lined with overgrown weeds and a sagging chain-link fence. The driver's voice crackled over the intercom, thick with the practiced indifference of someone who had announced the same thing 100 times before. Quick systems check, just a few minutes. Feel free to stretch your legs. No one stirred at first. The passengers, most of whom had settled into the dull rhythm of the ride, looked up in vague annoyance but didn't protest. One by one, they began to rise, stepping off the bus in lazy, disjointed waves. Michael remained where he was, eyes fixed on the back of the bus. The man and the girl hadn't moved. The man leaned back against the seat, tapping his fingers along his thigh in a pattern that seemed more measured now. Calculating. The girl still sat perfectly still, her small hands clenched together in her lap, her shoulders bowed in. He couldn't forget the look in her eyes. Michael stepped into the aisle, walking slowly toward the front door, under the guise of exiting like the others. Outside, the heat wrapped around him like a damp cloth. He stood beside the open bus doors, pretending to check his phone, but his gaze remained locked on the reflection in the side mirror. The man shifted slightly, leaning toward the girl, and though Michael couldn't hear the words, the message was clear in her reaction. She shrank further, her head ducking down, her knees curling tighter. His throat tightened. It wasn't just fear. It was learned stillness, conditioned silence. His instincts screamed louder now, echoing with old voices, the kind that had once barked commands across dusty camps and reinforced checkpoints. He tried to suppress them, but they surged anyway. Observe, evaluate, respond. There was something very wrong with that man. Something not even the calm exterior could mask. And the girl, she wasn't just quiet, she was erased, folded into herself like she had been taught to be invisible. Michael moved a few paces away from the bus, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number from memory. It had been nearly 2 years since he'd called Victor Reynolds, his former CO turned beat cop. They hadn't spoken much since Michael's return, and Victor wasn't the sentimental type, but there were still threads of loyalty between them, frayed but intact. Victor answered on the third ring, his voice clipped. "Reynolds?" "It's Hart," Michael said. "I need a favor." A pause, and a quiet, "Where are you?" "Eastbound Route 12, bus number 68. Just pulled over near the old auto yard. We've got a situation." "What kind of situation?" Michael hesitated, watching as the man inside leaned forward, resting a hand on the girl's shoulder. She didn't move. "Man traveling with a young black girl. Something's wrong. She's not his daughter." Victor was silent for a long second. "You sure?" "No, but I've seen this before. She's terrified. She hasn't said a word. Her wrists have marks. He's holding her like she's not supposed to go anywhere." Victor exhaled. "Michael, I don't need you getting in the middle of something if this turns out to be a custody thing or a foster situation. You want to go viral as the guy who accused the wrong parent?" "I don't care about going viral," Michael said tightly. "I care about that girl. Something's wrong." Another pause. "All right. I'll send someone to intercept. 10 minutes out. Keep your distance." Michael hung up, jaw clenched. 10 minutes. 10 minutes could be too long. He returned to the bus, climbing the steps slowly. Most of the passengers were still offloading or lingering near the sidewalk. The driver sat behind the wheel, muttering into a handheld radio. Michael nodded at him and made his way back to his seat without drawing attention. The man in the back barely acknowledged him. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp. Michael could feel them following him, registering the movement. The girl hadn't shifted. She sat like a doll, carved from fear. The passengers began reboarding. An older woman settled into a seat near the front, fanning herself with a receipt. 2 teenagers climbed back on, laughing too loudly about something on a phone screen. Michael saw the shift in the man's shoulders, the way his fingers twitched along the armrest. He was waiting for the bus to move again. Michael glanced around, looking for someone, anyone, who might have noticed the same thing. But the other riders were in their own bubbles, lost in distractions. The woman across the aisle caught his eye for a moment and offered a look of suspicion. "You again?" she said, loud enough to draw attention. "You really gonna keep watching them like that?" Michael didn't respond. The driver gave a cursory glance in the rear view, his face unreadable. "You don't think that's his daughter?" the woman continued. "Why? 'Cause she's black and he's not?" Michael's hands tightened on his knees. "Because she's terrified," he said quietly. "She's quiet," the woman countered. "That's not a crime. You ever seen a kid behave in public before?" Michael turned his gaze away. There was no point arguing. The scene had already been shaped in their minds. A white man, fresh-faced and serious, accusing a respectable-looking white man of wrongdoing with a black child. The racial optics were terrible. It didn't matter how gently Michael tried to raise his concerns. The narrative had already cast him in the role of the overreaching white savior, the soldier who thought everything could be solved by force. But instincts didn't care about perception. They cared about survival. And every alarm in his gut was blaring now. The engine hummed back to life, and the bus lurched forward. Michael's eyes flicked to the mirror again. The man whispered something into the girl's ear, and she flinched. Just slightly. But enough to tip the balance. He rose from his seat, slowly, carefully, and walked toward the front. As he passed the girl, she looked up again. This time, her lips moved. One word, barely a whisper. "Help." Michael stopped just for a second. His breath caught in his throat. The man's eyes snapped to him, hard and sharp. Michael moved forward, past the driver, and stood near the folding doors. He didn't press the button to stop the bus. He didn't want to spook anyone. Not yet. "Driver," he said quietly, "can you call it in?" The man gave him a long look. "What exactly are you saying?" "There's a girl in the back who just mouthed the word help," Michael said. "I don't know what's going on, but she's not safe." The driver hesitated. "You accusing someone of something?" "I'm asking you to call it in," Michael repeated, quietly. The driver picked up his radio. Michael turned back toward the aisle. The man had shifted now, his body angled defensively, eyes flicking from Michael to the driver, back again. The girl was still. Her hands trembled slightly on her lap. Michael took one step toward them. The man stood. "Something wrong?" he asked, voice calm, too calm. Michael held his ground. "We just need to stay put until the police can check on everything." "I don't have time for this," the man said. "I have custody. I can show you the papers. She's my daughter." The girl didn't confirm, didn't look at him. Her head dropped again. Michael took another step. "Let her speak," he said. "I don't need to prove anything to you," the man snapped, louder now. Passengers turned. "She's not saying a word," Michael said. "That should concern everyone here." "She's shy," the man barked. "She has anxiety around strangers. You're the one harassing us." A murmur began to ripple through the bus. The older woman from earlier shook her head. "You're doing too much, soldier boy." The driver spoke into the radio again, low and fast. Then the girl moved. She reached for the water bottle sitting at her feet, half empty, scratched plastic, and when the man looked away for a split second, she unscrewed the cap, slid something inside, and screwed it back on. Michael caught the motion. Their eyes met again. Her lips didn't move, but the message was clear. She had sent a message. Hidden it. He stepped forward and extended a hand. "May I see the bottle?" The man blocked him. "Touch her again, and I'll press charges." The police arrived 5 minutes later. 2 officers boarded the bus, their expressions already tight with the knowledge that this could spiral fast. The man greeted them with confidence, producing paperwork, talking calmly. The girl remained silent. But when one officer gently asked her name, she hesitated, then looked toward Michael. He nodded once, just a small movement, encouraging. The officer asked again, and this time she reached for the water bottle, handed it over. The officer unscrewed the cap, pulled out a tightly rolled receipt. Written in shaky block letters, "He is not my dad." Silence fell across the bus. The girl looked down again, her shoulders curling inward. Michael exhaled, his heart pounded, not with victory but with grief. Not because he had been right, but because he hadn't been wrong. Because his instincts had saved someone, but only just. And because he knew this was only the beginning. The sun had begun to lower by the time the bus was cordoned off by the police. Its tires still warm from the ride, its windows reflecting a city that had no idea what had just been prevented within its walls. Flashing red and blue lights cut through the ambient gray, bouncing off the dented metal frame and painting shadows across the cracked sidewalk. The girl was seated at the edge of the bus now, huddled in a woolen blanket provided by one of the officers. Her small frame trembled slightly beneath the weight of it, though the evening was warm. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ground, wide and far away. She had yet to speak a word aloud. The man who had claimed to be her father stood in handcuffs, flanked by 2 officers, his jaw clenched but otherwise silent. Michael watched him from a short distance, his own pulse still beating heavy in his ears. He didn't feel relief. Not yet. There was a waiting period between suspicion and vindication, a dead zone where everything was exposed and raw. He had crossed a line, and for a brief, soul-crushing moment, he hadn't been sure whether it would lead to justice or shame. They had taken the note, "He is not my dad," and examined it. One officer, a younger man with buzzed hair and a weary squint, had quietly handed it to his partner. The older officer read it, gave Michael a long look, then turned back to the man in cuffs. "You want to explain this?" he'd asked. The man had smiled, small and sharp. "She's adopted. She's been with me 2 years. Some kids don't adjust. You have documents? They're at home. You're welcome to come see them." It was the smoothness that unsettled Michael most. No fear, no confusion, just calm deflection. As if this were a routine inconvenience. The officers had checked his ID. It looked clean, no warrants, no history, nothing in the local registry flagged. The man's name was Malcolm P. West, 39, business consultant. His address was in a gated community 2 towns over. Michael had watched them hesitate. "I'm telling you, he's not her father," Michael said, keeping his voice low but firm. "And we're taking this seriously," the older officer replied, watching the girl now. "But this needs to be handled carefully. There are custody laws, state adoptions, court orders. We can't just run with assumptions." Michael understood. Of course he did. But assumptions were exactly what had brought him this far, and the assumption that someone else would act if he didn't had nearly let a child disappear. One of the officers crouched in front of the girl, soft-voiced, kind-eyed. "Sweetheart, I know this is scary, but we just want to help you. Can you tell me your name?" The girl looked at Michael. Her gaze lingered, searching for something: reassurance, permission, perhaps even belief. Then she looked back down. "We can't force her to speak," the younger officer murmured. "Not without a guardian." "Which she may not have," Michael replied. "And if this guy is lying, it'll come out soon enough." Soon enough. Michael didn't like those words. He had seen what could happen in the space of soon enough. Blood soaked into sand, trucks overturned, children gone between one heartbeat and the next. He crossed his arms and stepped back, letting the police do their work. He didn't want to obstruct anything. He didn't want to play hero, but he also didn't want to vanish into the background before he knew she was safe. A few feet away, one of the bystanders who'd ridden the bus was recording everything on their phone. Michael recognized her as the woman who had accused him of overstepping earlier. She was narrating now, loud enough for others to hear. "See this?" she said. "This guy, some ex-soldier, he basically attacked a father on a bus just 'cause the kid didn't look like him. We gotta stop pretending white boys in uniforms are automatically right." Michael turned toward her. "You have no idea what happened." "I saw enough," she snapped. "You were staring at them like a hawk from the start. You assumed the worst." I responded to a child who asked for help. She didn't say anything. She mouthed it, and she handed over a note. "She's a kid. Kids say all kinds of things." Michael clenched his jaw. "She didn't say it to you." Her mouth curled, bitter and righteous. "You're not a cop. You're just another soldier who thinks he can save everyone. Not everyone needs saving." Michael didn't reply. He couldn't, because she was partly right. That was what dug the deepest. He had made assumptions. He had acted. And if he'd been wrong, but he hadn't been. He knew it. Even if the paperwork turned out pristine, even if every document bore a judge's seal, there was something in that child's silence that told him the truth. The officers finished questioning the man and led him toward the squad car. He didn't resist. He didn't shout. He didn't even look angry. That unnerved Michael more than any tantrum would have. The quiet ones were always the most dangerous. The girl was taken into the care of Child Protective Services. A social worker named Denise knelt beside her, speaking softly, holding a clipboard she never looked at. The girl whispered something that Michael couldn't hear. Denise nodded, and they left together, climbing into a different car. The girl didn't look back. Michael stood on the sidewalk long after the bus had pulled away, long after the last of the onlookers had wandered off. He felt hollow, not defeated, not victorious, just emptied out. A few minutes later, Victor's unmarked cruiser pulled up. He stepped out, wearing a look that hovered somewhere between annoyed and impressed. "You really know how to call in favors," he said. "I didn't have time to be polite." Victor nodded toward where the bus had been. "What's the fallout?" She wrote it down, that he wasn't her father. "Handwritten note?" He raised an eyebrow. "Not a confession. Not proof." Michael bristled. "It's something." Victor sighed. "Look, I'm not saying you were wrong, but you've been back, 4 months? You jump into a bus and blow up someone's life based on instinct? You're lucky no one shot you, much less sued you. I didn't blow up anything. I followed the signs. Signs that only you seem to see." Michael turned to him. "You think I overreacted?" Victor didn't answer right away. "I think the world's changed. People are ready to jump down your throat for anything that smells like profiling. And a white man pulling rank on a white guy with a black kid, that's landmine territory. I didn't do it because she was black, Michael said quietly. Victor gave him a long look. I know, but do they? Michael looked up at the sky, which had turned the color of ash. I don't care. If I had waited, that girl could have disappeared, and no one would have noticed until it was too late. Victor didn't argue. CPS will do their part now. Background check, medical exam. We'll see what turns up. You think they'll find anything? Victor shrugged. Depends how smart he is and how big the network behind him is. Michael's eyes narrowed. Network? Victor gave him a cautious glance. You didn't hear this from me, but we've had whispers for months. A handful of kids passed around like packages, always with legit papers, always with clean-looking adults. You dig deep enough and find that the papers were issued out of state, sometimes out of the country. Quiet adoptions, private agencies, stuff that doesn't show up on the surface. Michael felt a cold knot settle in his chest. You think he's a part of it? Wouldn't be the first time someone slipped through. The two men stood in silence, watching the road. Do me a favor, Victor said eventually. Stay out of it for now. Let the system work. I know you want to do something, but you're not wearing a badge. If you get involved again, you're going to cause more trouble than good. Michael nodded slowly, but the agreement didn't sit well in his mouth. He had spent too many years in places where the system didn't exist, where waiting meant dying. He went home that night to an apartment that still didn't feel like his. The bed was neatly made, the dishes clean, the TV untouched. He sat at the small kitchen table with a cold bottle of water and stared at the far wall, unable to stop seeing her eyes. She had said help, she had meant it, and he had believed her. 2 days later, his phone buzzed with a text from Victor. Call me. Michael stepped outside before dialing, letting the wind press against his face. The phone rang twice. They ran the guy's name through Federal, Victor said. Guess what came up? Michael didn't answer. Nothing, no priors, no flags. But get this, the adoption agency that signed the girl over doesn't exist anymore. Shut down 2 years ago. Michael's breath caught. That's not all, Victor continued. One of the notaries on the papers has been dead for 5. Signature doesn't match either. So it's forged. Looks that way, which means she was taken, and whoever orchestrated it knew exactly how to make it look legal. Michael didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, Do you know where she is? She's in temporary foster care, protective custody. They're not releasing details. Michael looked out across the rooftops. Is she safe? Victor was quiet, then, for now. Michael hung up. For now. It wasn't enough. Not anymore. The morning was quiet, too quiet for a city that rarely slept. Pale sunlight filtered through a thin veil of clouds as Michael sat in his truck across from the Child Protective Services building. The air smelled of wet concrete and exhaust. Every few minutes the doors would hiss open and another child would step out with a social worker, a plastic bag of belongings clutched in one hand, uncertainty in the other. Most of them looked numb, floating through a process they didn't understand. None of them were the girl. He hadn't slept properly since the incident on the bus. Even with Victor's updates, even with the assurances that she was safe for now, Michael couldn't let it go. The memory of her eyes haunted him, not the fear, not even the silence, but the unmistakable awareness. She had known, and she had chosen him. Out of all those faces, all that noise, she had looked at him and asked for help. That wasn't something you walked away from. The system was moving slowly, predictably. Victor had said the investigation was underway. Forensics had flagged the adoption papers as likely forgeries. The agency they'd supposedly come from no longer existed. The notary's signature was linked to a deceased individual. But all of it was circumstantial. The man, Malcolm West, if that was even his real name, had lawyered up immediately. No confession, no explanation, just silence and legal barriers. Without a confession or solid link to a wider operation, CPS could only move so fast. Michael had seen this pattern before. In war zones, in refugee camps, even back home on the edge of forgotten towns. Children moved like packages, hands off, paperwork neat, trails scrubbed. The victims were always the same, the vulnerable, the unseen, and the world only paid attention when it was too late. He was considering going in, just to ask, to check, to make sure, when Victor's car pulled up behind him. No lights, no sirens. Just a black sedan with dust on the hood and tension in its wake. Victor climbed out slowly, coffee in one hand, folder in the other. He tapped on Michael's window. "You're not supposed to be here." Michael opened the door. "And yet, here I am." Victor sighed. "You planning on sitting in this lot all day?" "Depends." "On what?" "On whether or not I get answers." Victor handed him the folder. Inside were printouts, copies of the adoption application, a child welfare intake form, a few grainy photographs. Michael flipped through them quickly, pausing only when he saw her name. "Janelle," he read aloud. "Janelle Ayers." 8 years old, Victor said. "Reported missing 15 months ago in Cleveland. Mother overdosed, no father listed. She was put into emergency placement, then just disappeared." Michael's stomach turned. "How does that happen?" "The usual way," Victor said, his voice dry. "Overworked caseworkers, bad record keeping, maybe someone got paid to move a file to the wrong pile. Hard to say. The trail goes cold 2 weeks after she entered the system." Michael looked back at the building. "So, how'd she end up on a bus with that man?" "That's the part we're still figuring out. Best guess, she was trafficked, not in the way most people think. This wasn't a grab-and-sell job. This was structured. Papers were filed. A name was changed. A new identity was built around her. And no one caught it." Victor shrugged. "Who was looking?" The truth stung. Michael closed the folder and handed it back. "I want to see her." "Not happening. She needs to know she's not alone. She's under a gag order. We're treating her as a material witness now, which means she's in a secure location. She won't talk to anyone else. You said it yourself. She chose me." Victor hesitated, then lowered his voice. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but she asked about you." Michael's breath caught. "When?" "Yesterday, quietly. Wouldn't talk to the therapist. Barely spoke to the social worker, but when they mentioned you, she looked up. Said, 'Is he coming back?'" Michael clenched his fists. "Then let me see her." "You're not family. You're not law enforcement. You're barely a civilian in this." "I'm the only one she trusts." Victor exhaled long and low. "There's a hearing in 2 days. The court will decide if she stays in the system or gets placed somewhere permanent. If she doesn't speak, they might hand her over to the same kind of setup we just pulled her out of. And next time, no one will see it." Michael stared at the building. "Then I need to get her to talk." Victor rubbed a hand over his face. "You'll have 5 minutes." It wasn't enough, but it was something. They drove in silence, heading toward a temporary shelter on the outskirts of the city. The building was old but clean, tucked behind a line of trees and a rusting security gate. Inside, the lights were soft and the walls painted in faded murals, cartoon animals with missing eyes, rainbows that had dulled with time. The air smelled of plastic and something sterile, like old crayons and worry. Janelle sat in a room at the end of the hallway, a blanket wrapped around her like a shield. She was smaller than he remembered, or maybe the room was just too big. When she saw Michael, her eyes widened, but she didn't move. She didn't run or smile. She just stared, as if trying to decide if he was real. Michael sat in the chair across from her. "Hey." She didn't answer. He kept his voice low. "I'm not here to scare you, or ask you to do anything you don't want to do." She blinked once. "I just wanted you to know that you're not alone." She tugged the blanket tighter. "They're trying to figure out where you belong, but they don't know the whole story. You're the only one who does." Still nothing. Michael looked down at his hands. "When I was in the army, we used to go into villages where no one talked. Too scared. Too many times they'd been hurt by people who said they were there to help. So they stopped trusting. They stayed quiet." He paused, letting the words settle. "But sometimes one person would speak. Just one. And it changed everything." He looked up. "I think you're that person." For a long time she said nothing. Then, so quietly he almost missed it. "They said if I talked, I'd disappear." Michael leaned forward. "Who?" She shook her head. "All of them. Every time I moved. Every new house. They all said it. Sometimes with words. Sometimes with looks. You learn fast." Michael swallowed. "That's not going to happen again." "You don't know that." "No," he admitted, "but I'm not leaving, and I'll fight like hell to make sure no one takes you again." She watched him wary, then hesitantly. "Are you a cop?" "No." "Then why did you help me?" Michael smiled just a little. "Because you asked." That was all she said, but she didn't look away again. 2 days later, she testified in court. Not loudly, not confidently, but enough. Enough to keep her out of the system. Enough to force a full investigation into the fake agency, the forged documents, the network of hands that had passed her like cargo. Michael sat in the back of the courtroom, silent and still, his heart pounding. When it was over, she looked for him, and when their eyes met, she smiled. A month later, Michael sat on a park bench across from a playground. The sun was high. Children ran in circles. Birds darted between trees. And on the far side of the grass, a little girl with braids and a red hoodie chased a dog with more joy than he had thought possible. She was free. She never saw him watching, and that was how he wanted it. Quiet. Simple. No thanks needed. He stood eventually and turned to go. In his pocket, folded and worn, was the receipt she'd written on. The words had faded, but he didn't need to read them anymore. He remembered. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our next videos and discover other powerful stories. And if this meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to see it.